Hello and welcome to Art Appreciation. I like to start the semester off usually by talking a little bit about what to expect out of the class, things that we will do and things we won't do. So a couple of things that I think are important to remember is that there are limitations to what an Art Appreciation class can do for you. If you don't like a particular piece of art, there's not a whole lot that an art appreciation class can do to force you to like it. Certainly can't convince everyone that every single piece of art is equally good. Those are all issues of personal taste, and so we'll talk a lot about the difference between appreciating and being head over heels in love with a particular piece. There's plenty of things that I can appreciate the quality of, for instance, that I might not want to have on the wall in my own living room, right? So we'll talk about the difference between appreciation and sort of being in love with a piece of art. But very important to remember that you'll see art by people who have different points of view than you do. And that does not in any way mean that it's going to change or destroy your own personal beliefs, whether we're talking about spiritual beliefs or political beliefs. We do want to take a look at art from points of view of people who are different from us. That helps us to learn and to grow and to understand the world around us better, but it's not going to change your worldview necessarily. Definitely some things that people think that an art appreciation or art history teacher expects. Sometimes people are afraid that they're going to do poorly in art appreciation because they think that the teacher expects them to already know everything about the history of art, and that is completely not true. There are definitely pieces of art that I assume that you probably have seen or are somewhat familiar with, but I don't expect that you already know art history at all. And I certainly don't expect that you're already talented at studio things like drawing or sculpting, or that you have a lot of experience in those areas. So do not worry about that. Things that sometimes come up in art appreciation, though, that can be kind of irritating. Sometimes people will go out of their way to find an example of a piece of art that has made it into the headlines, into news, because it's challenging or weird, or people think it's really stupid and they want to get into a massive debate about not so much the piece itself, which can be interesting, but usually it's about how all current art is stupid. And I'm really not on board for that kind of discussion. Sometimes people will tend to argue in a discussion board, for instance, that there's a piece that they don't think should be considered art because they personally don't like it. I always like to share the example of my dad, who is actually a pretty well-known sculptor, but he is not a fan of rap music. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't like it at all. I have tried various ways of getting him to appreciate it, like trying to share stuff that I thought he might like from a social political standpoint, and it's a no-go. To him, it just shouldn't exist. I don't want to get into that kind of position either. So we want to try to draw a line between our personal taste and whether or not a piece of art or an artist has a right to make the thing that they make. Another thing that sometimes comes up is that people think things that look simple or are abstract because the person lacks talent, or it's so easy that a kid could do it or I could do it, so therefore it's not good. I think personally that that is a weird position to have, because it sort of implies that you're not worthy of making a contribution to the world around you. I definitely would take an issue with that. But a lot of times we think of abstraction as being like an excuse or a cover-up for not having good skill, and it really truly is not that. So I want to make sure that I share with you some examples that show you how people who arrived at things that might seem simple on the surface got there through a lot of hard work. And not to lean on it, but rap would be a form of music that in some points of view might be considered super simple. It doesn't have lyric quality. It's really based primarily on rhythm and rhyme. but there's not musicality the way that people are accustomed to creating melody lines, for instance, right? It takes some of those elements away. It simplifies. But to say that that makes it easy to do is hilarious. If you've ever heard someone who can't do it attempt to do it, you can see how hard it really is. So just because it's different or simplified from something you're used to doesn't necessarily make it bad. Some things that definitely come up, though, are sometimes a piece of art will become well known because it's kind of controversial and people get really up in arms about it. So let's do one so we can say we did it and we can talk about kind of the difference between grabbing a headline and thinking about art with a more objective kind of viewpoint. So in 2003, there was a very famous art exhibition of an installation sculpture that was made of several blenders that were on pedestals. The blenders had goldfish in them, and so of course the headline was that this artist had made this cruel and horrible piece to destroy and kill goldfish, and it was a big news story at that particular time. Well, I immediately was offended by it because I was thinking from an animal rights standpoint, like, this is not, killing something to cook or eat it. If that's somehow just like cruelty for the sake of cruelty, it just seemed horrible to me. I got really angry about it right off the bat without reading anything about it. I just saw a headline that was like, artist blends goldfish for art. And I thought, oh, I hate this. This is stupid. And inevitably a student brought it to me and they were like, see, all, contemporary art is so dumb and I hate it so much. And explain to me why this is good. And I said, well, I don't really think it is, but, let me look at it and think about it a little bit. I'll get back to you. So I read up on it and I realized really quickly that the artist who made the piece was actually not the person who did the harm to the fish. What the artist had done was create a situation in which there were blenders full of water, goldfish in each. They were attached to electricity. That was all. The person who did the cruelty, who killed the fish, who turned the blender on, was one of the spectators of the work. Somebody walked in, saw it, pushed the button, boom. So really, the person who made the art just created the situation, and the person who created the sort of horrific aspect was a member of the public. That was kind of an interesting thing to me, to think about the fact that it was really a member of the public, that if there is a potential for cruelty, somebody is going to be the jerk who does the cruel thing. And that was really what the piece was about. It kind of surprisingly made the piece seem to have a little bit more meaning, a little more importance to me after the fact. So yeah, do I love it? No. Is it complete garbage? Maybe it takes a little bit of a second look. But what it did remind me of, and what this story often makes me think about, is how frequently I do the same thing with social media, with a tweet or with a share of a headline. I'll see a headline, it'll make me immediately mad. I don't read the article, and then I jump to a conclusion. So really what I want us to be aware of is to try to think with visual art, to try to at least investigate a little bit before we make a snap decision and see if there might be more to it, if there might be more meaning underneath it than just the shocking headline that grabs our attention. Okay, so that brings us to another kind of silly aspect of making a snap decision about art. It's really easy to look at the beeps and decide that, oh, I hate that sound, or to look at somebody similar to him, someone who got famous young, who may or may not be all that great, and decide that that's like, an absolute thing that I hate, or that maybe just because you're successful early on that you're instantly great. It's kind of interesting to contrast somebody like Britney or Justin Bieber with Mozart. They all got really famous really, really young. They certainly have made a lot of success out of their careers. I suppose arguably the current pop stars have made more money than Mozart did, but is is their youth a barrier to them being good or bad? Are their careers going to stand the test of time? That's a question mark too, right? It's kind of interesting thing to consider. How about my dad's situation, right? Like, if it's rap, it doesn't exist. Well, there's plenty of people who would say the same thing about opera, right? There are different styles, different ways of expression, different modes of expression that are going to appeal to some people and not to other people. There are artists who are going to succeed young. There are artists who are going to have to succeed after working at it for a long time. None of these things are the debatable points of whether a piece of art is good or whether an artist has a right to express themselves. Really that we're running into more than anything, again, is that issue truly of personal taste. I don't necessarily love everything that falls under either category of rap or opera, but I would certainly hate to live in a world where we ban one or the other form just because we've decided it doesn't conform to the rules of what art should be. I think we should really think about our art consumption the same way we do anything else. If there's a song you don't like, you change the radio or you don't download the MP3. If there's a TV show you don't like, you stop streaming it, right? The same thing could be said with visual art. There's going to be some things that appeal to you, some things that don't. It's kind of a simple thing. Another thing that kind of jumps at me that seems kind of funny is how art is, to an extent, kind of trendy. Nobody in their right mind is going to dress like King Louis XIV there on the right-hand side of your screen in tights and high heels and a big wig. That doesn't seem to fit with today's style for manly men. But what's funny to me is that you guys on campus wouldn't dress like the guy at the top left either. That style of everything being super oversized, pants big enough for 3 people to wear them at the same time, was kind of a 90s trend that turned into the super tight skinny jeans of the 2000s, which baffles me as well, right? They seem way too tight to be comfortable. They look cool, right? That's the same kind of thing that happens in visual art. Sometimes we find things that become fashionable, that become trendy, and maybe we don't really like them for any reason other than they are the thing that's current at that particular moment. It does make you question, like, how much of your taste is really yours and how much of it is based on the time period that you're living in and the culture around you. The argument of, oh, anybody could do that, so it's not good, comes up quite a bit as well, and it comes up a lot with these particular examples. The artist at the top left is Piet Mondrian. The artist at the right is, of course, Jackson Pollock. Pollock got famous for dripping paint. Mondrian got famous for reducing down to just red, yellow, blue, black, white, straight lines, rectangles, and squares. Either of those styles seem like they'd be easy to imitate. I actually have given an assignment several times in Art at Preach to try to imitate a Jackson Pollock. It's a lot harder than you think to even do it, and none of them really look like what he achieved with it. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think. It's easy to say, on the one hand, anyone could do it or a kid could do that. I taught little kids. I taught a class for a while called Pint-Sized Picassos. They were 3-year-olds making art. They definitely didn't make stuff like either of these two artists, but because their styles seem simplified or seem easy to do, a lot of times we think maybe they're not so great. I don't think any of us would feel that these are terrible or easy to do, or that anyone could do them. The flower drawing by Mondrian is incredibly detailed and meticulous and shows a massive amount of skill. And who would ever have thought that Pollock could actually paint and draw something that looked like the real world, looked like he sat and looked at a landscape and made an image based on it? Both of these artists were trained and knew how to do it, quote unquote, the right way. So for them, abstraction was honestly a choice. It was something they arrived at. It was something that they evolved into in their work for various reasons. But sometimes with art especially when we're looking at an art textbook, we're just seeing kind of the greatest hits, like the most famous pieces by a handful of people. We're certainly not delving in to enough depth to be able to see how those people arrived at what they did or what they tried first before they tried something else. So it's easy to say when you look at the final product, oh, I don't like that, that person doesn't have talent. It's another thing to realize that they went through many artists, most artists, went through multiple stages of development before they arrived at the thing that made them famous. A lot of people also question, well, the good techniques are gone and no one's doing them anymore. And when they say good, most people mean art that looks like what it's supposed to look like, where the painting, but it looks so real, it almost looks like a photograph. And that's kind of the style that you see here from the Dutch Baroque from the 1700s. Arguably, you could say, yeah, these are almost photographically realistic. They're certainly impressive, but that's not the only thing about these paintings that impresses me. There are other aspects other than just the amount of detail that I like. I like the compositions. I like the colors, for instance. I'm interested in the subjects as well. But it's wrong to say that those skills are gone or that those techniques have completely disappeared. Check this out. This is the work of an artist named Odd Nerdrum, who through the 1980s into the 90s, early 2000s, was doing paintings and drawings with the same level of detail, skill, highlight, and shadow. They looked very, very much like paintings from the 1700s. He was doing those in the 20th century. So those skills are definitely still out there. We want to remember that art, if anything, has become a much, much broader range of options. There are lots of artists working today who are doing things with an enormous amount of detail and with traditional skills, but doing it in a slightly different way. That's definitely the case with this example. This is the work of Mark Tansey, and it clearly is based on a pretty famous photograph. If you went to grade school in North Carolina or middle school in North Carolina, it'd be hard to have missed the history of the Wright brothers and the first flight, the first airplanes. That's obviously what this is based on, is a photograph of them flying their first planes. But instead of the Wright brothers, we have instead Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, who were the inventors of Cubism, and here they are kind of flying a Cubist violin playing, I suppose. It's the work of Mark Tansey, who's a painter who very often relies on the realism, the skill of making something look like a photograph, or even reproducing a photograph in a way, but with an ironic twist that makes it so much more interesting. So could he draw and paint realistically? Sure. Is that the only way to go? Maybe not. How about these? These are pieces by my favorite artist, Henri Matisse. Matisse was the leader of the Fauve movement in the early 20th century. Arguably, he and Picasso are probably the two most famous and most influential artists of the first half of the 20th century. And Matisse is really well known for a kind of simplified style, both in painting and in sculpture. And if you only look at his end results, they sometimes look like they were really easy to achieve. If you look at some of the pieces that he made where he shows steps along the way, you can see how he went from more naturalistic, believable proportions and details to a more simplified, more abstract approach. So this is a series of sculptures he made of the same pose, a female nude standing. She's facing away from us. She's kind of resting her head against her forearm. And the first version of this series is, relatively speaking, accurate in its proportion and its anatomy detail. The second version, which he did a few years later, has much sharper angles, more straight lines, but still a fair amount of detail. This next piece he did a couple decades down the line. The last one is completed in 1930. So step 3 and step 4, he goes really far down the line of simplifying, reducing, taking details away, exaggerating some things, eliminating others. He's making things increasingly abstract. Now, if I had just shown you the final piece, back number 4, and said it was a person standing from the back view, you might think this person can't draw or paint to save their lives. But if you see it as an evolution from one step to the next, you can really kind of see what he's doing. So it might look simple at the end, but it's a lot of work and thought to arrive at that kind of level of simplicity. This is another example to think about with Matisse. There's a group of people dancing in a circle at the top, and it's a cutie patootie sweetie pie little thing that I found on the internet. It's certainly different from this. These figures are far more abstract, less believable, and yet they feel more emotionally real to me. You know, in an interesting kind of way, this piece is not perfect in its proportions. The subjects are, even in some places, ambiguous in terms of gender and in terms of detail, but they are extremely vibrant in terms of color. What you're looking at are bright orange colors against a strongly contrasting blue background. Those are complementary colors that are going to feel more intense when they are seen side by side. The top picture is a snapshot. If you know those particular kids, I'm sure it's hugely emotional. If you like kids, it's cute and sweet and uplifting. On the other hand, the figures in the painting are anonymous. They're abstract to the point that they barely have faces, and yet they feel more universal, in a weird way, a bit more powerful. I can honestly say that this painting is one of the only pieces that I've had a spontaneous reaction to seeing in person. I had the opportunity to go to Russia to the Hermitage Museum, which is a former palace of the Tsar. The Hermitage owns this painting. It's really quite large. It's over 8 feet tall, over 10 feet wide. And I was there a couple of times, but I went the first time on a day when very few other people were there. I got to be alone with this painting. And again, Matisse was a big hero to me when I was a student. So it was a big deal to me to see it in person. And I realized at one point as I sat there staring at it, that seeing it in person and at that kind of scale, it had a much bigger impact on me than it ever would in a book or a PowerPoint or a lecture. And I realized that I pushed my glasses up with my hand, I touched my face, and my face was wet. I was crying. I wasn't sad, but my body was like overwhelmed with kind of the intense emotion of this painting and was responding in, I guess, the only way it really knew how. It was not sadness that I was feeling, but it was an intense emotion. My body was like responding to it in a really intense kind of way. And I think the reason for that is really summed up right here, this gesture between these two hands. All the other figures, their hands are clasped pretty tightly. This is the only place where they're not connected. And you see this figure feels like it's almost falling. This figure, in a really difficult move, is kind of reaching backward, almost impossibly behind itself to catch that person's hand, which seemed to me to be kind of a universal symbol for the fact that we're all struggling at different times. We all feel like we're on our own. We're isolated, or we are unable to solve our own problems without help, and we sometimes feel like there's no one who's going to reach out a hand to help us. And then, lo and behold, most of the time there is some option, some way, some assistance. Someone reaches a hand back and tries to soften the blow or to catch you before you completely fall. To me, that felt like a universal experience. The top photo is cute and sweet. It's a sweet little snapshot. If you know those little babies, it's very precious. But the painting is more about the human condition and what we owe to each other on a deeper level. It has a different kind of emotional impact. It's abstract, it's simplified, but that doesn't mean it isn't powerful. Some things that we definitely are going to try to do over the course of this semester. I want to make sure to get examples not just from what's in the textbook, what's in the lectures, the PowerPoints, some things that you can see that are from all different styles and times within the Western art tradition. I definitely want you to get some experience in hearing about and seeing how art is made, learning about the techniques themselves. But especially, I want you to be able to make your own educated decisions. My goal is not to tell you that you have to like what I like. I want you to learn to be able to look at art, evaluate it, think about it, put it in context, think about it in terms of history, and be able to make some decisions about what you like yourself, but some well-informed decisions. You are definitely going to see art that you'll hate. This is not a piece that I personally like. This is a style we call minimalism. It is exactly what the name implies. It's as simple as it could be. It looks like it was made by a computer. You don't see any brushstrokes. This was painted by hand on canvas. It's a great big 72-inch square canvas. It's not something that appeals to me personally. You're definitely going to see art that might not do it for you. You might see art that you think is really weird. These are examples by a sculptor who's well known for making projected light and sculpture with light in three-dimensional spaces. You might not love this. I can personally say that when I first learned about him in school, I didn't really get it. And then I went to an exhibition and saw some work in person, and it was the coolest show that I had seen that year. It was really fun to be in the room with these things. It doesn't do much on paper, in a printout, in a book, or in a magazine. In person, maybe it would do something for you. You might see work that you're like, why does that even exist? This piece is very strange. It's a mishmash of a lot of different found objects welded and assembled together. It may not immediately make sense to you, and it may not have a narrative story that the artist intends for you to understand or to receive the same thing. A lot of contemporary work is purely visual or is intentionally a bit ironic, and that's certainly the work of Nancy Graves. But are you going to see stuff that you already know and stuff that you love? I guarantee it. You're absolutely going to see work by people who are artists that you've known and admired your whole lives. Obviously, this is The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. It's one of the paintings that made me want to paint when I was a young artist. So I think that honestly, you're going to see both things. You're going to see art that'll challenge you a bit, art that might make you think, art that you might not love, and you're going to see for sure things that you absolutely adore. Of course, every college student in the world practically loves Salvador Dali, especially this particular piece. You'll see other pieces by him, and you'll see other art by other artists in the same style. The surrealist movement is diverse, and there's tons of different things to see. Art by people that you've never heard of that you'll like at least close to as much as you like him, I promise you. Definitely you'll see stuff by people that you've heard of and that you like. You know M.C. Escher, you know his Impossible Staircases, you'll see other things by him as well. So I promise that you'll see some things that'll be unfamiliar to you. You'll see some stuff that will be familiar, and you'll learn about all of those things and learn to see and appreciate those things in a little bit new and a different way.